You've heard the story of the birth of Rome, built by two twins suckled by a she-wolf. But do you know its second founder? The one who delivered a broken city from the ashes and laid the foundations for an empire we can still see the ruins of today. But in 390 BC, this was a distant dream. Panic gripped Rome. Can you blame them? Its army scattered, its generals dead, its walls defenseless. And now, the Gauls were coming to claim their revenge. Brennus, king of the Gauls, had crushed the Roman legions at the Battle of the River Allia. But his victory wasn't absolute. He had stopped to loot the battlefield, and the survivors had slipped away. If he had made immediately for the city, the war would have been over, and Rome a footnote in history. But part of being a chief among chiefs was that you had to keep everyone rich and happy, and Brennus would only remain king of the Senones so long as he provided both. It was a delay that Rome sorely needed. Any able-bodied man, including the senators, were ordered to the Capitoline Hill, a hilltop in the city center that housed the Temple of Jupiter. But before it was home to their most important god, it was a hilltop fortress. Barricades were once again thrown up on the steps. Anything of value was moved up the steep cliffs, and weapons and provisions left for the men. Then the order was given to evacuate the city. Even the Vestal virgins were ordered to leave, and their sacred fire put into a cooking pot, and unceremoniously loaded onto a wagon squeezed between common housewares. But anyone sick or elderly was left to their fate. The evacuees couldn't risk being slowed down, and the soldiers on the hill couldn't spare their provisions. In a show of solidarity, the retired consuls of Rome invited them to join them in the forum. They cracked open their best wine, dressed in their finest clothes, and then sat down on ivory chairs in front of their houses and waited for death to come. Brennus's army arrived the next morning. The Colline Gate had been left open for them. Then the Gauls found the old men, sitting still as marble statues in the forum. They didn't move or speak. They just sat silently and judged the invaders. Hardly believing such regal things could exist, one Gaul reached out and tugged on an old man's beard. His hand was slapped away. The spell of the moment was broken. The men were butchered where they sat. And then the looting began. From the fortified Capitoline Hill, the last soldiers of Rome watched as their city burned around them. Dawn showed that nothing survived among the ashes and ruin, and that Brennus's army was moving towards the hill. The Romans met them at its steepest point. They slashed at them with rusty swords and broken spears, fighting with the reckless abandon of doomed men. With no way of getting up the steps, Brennus was forced to retreat. He wasn't able to take the Capitoline, but the Romans weren't coming down either. He set up a guard on the temple fortress, and then made them watch as he set his army loose on the countryside. The problem with a lengthy siege is the logistics. An army requires food, and lots of it, and without a supply train, it will quickly eat through any food in the area. So then it either has to move on or raid further afield to find more. The Gauls spread out from Rome like locusts, devouring anything in their path. Cities fell before them, one by one, stripped clean. But at Ardea, they crossed the one man who could stop them. Marcus Furius Camillus had been Rome's greatest general, but accusations of embezzlement had forced him into exile at the height of his power. Luckily, time away hadn't dulled his abilities. Knowing what awaited any city caught in the Gauls' path, he rallied the people of Ardea to fight. And in the dead of night, he snuck into the enemy camp and slit their throats in their sleep. News of the exploit traveled fast. One man was still willing to stand against the Gauls, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed an army. Other cities called anyone of age to serve, but one obstacle still remained. Only a Roman could lead the legions, and only the Senate could give Camillus back a citizenship to do it. And that was an impossible task, since the Senate was trapped on the Capitoline Hill. But a young volunteer, Communus Pontius, agreed to sneak into Rome and scale the sheer rock walls of the Capitoline to take the message to the Senate. In the dead of night, he scrambled up the steep cliffs, hand over hand, slipping on the precipitous rocks. The men he found at the top were shadows of their former selves, half-starved and on the verge of collapse. They welcomed their savior with open arms. In their time of emergency, Rome again turned to the one man who could do the impossible. They voted to restore Camillus and made him dictator. And then they agreed to turn Camillus loose. But Pontanus's daring climb hadn't gone unnoticed.
We'll attack the north wall.
But it's a sheer cliff. That would be insanity.
That's just what the Romans think.
The Gauls followed the same route up the cliff face, moving so quietly, the sentries and guard dogs failed to hear them. Unfortunately for the Gauls, they happened to climb up at the Temple of Juno, known for keeping a very unique sacred animal, and were met by a ferocious flock of angry geese. I realize that sounds kind of silly, but honestly, geese are bad-tempered at the best of times, and these hadn't been fed for the entirety of the siege. And when they saw the Gauls, they attacked with a winged fury of hell. The noise was so great that it roused the soldiers, and the Gauls were then thrown from the top. The Senate wanted to court-martial the guards that had fallen asleep, but as Rome was a republic, they instead put it to a vote, and elected that one man should be thrown off the cliff instead. Democracy in action. And then to celebrate, they crucified all the watchdogs, and then probably ate them because they were starving. And then somehow the crucifying of the dogs became an annual tradition, because history is even weirder than fiction sometimes. With supplies running out on the hill and in the Gallic camp below, disease was spreading through both armies. It was now a race against time for both sides. Brennus needed a way to end the siege and still save face. Seeing that the Romans were also starving, he offered them a new option. Pay the Gauls off, and they would just leave. The patricians refused. It would be too dishonorable. But when their soldiers caught wind of the offer, they threatened mutiny. And suddenly, they had no choice but to bargain. The price was set at 1,000 pounds of gold, nearly 18 million US dollars today. Both sides swore to the terms, and the gold was brought to be weighed at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. But when it was placed on the scales, the Romans found themselves short. The Gauls had brought their own heavier weights with them. The Romans rightly protested, but Brennus gave another of his mocking laughs, pulled out his sword, and tossed it on as well, simply saying, "We victus, woe to the defeated, because they are at the mercy of their conquerors." The Romans paid the money and looked to the horizon for a savior. Camillus didn't disappoint. He hadn't waited for the Senate's response. Assuming command of a tattered army almost completely made up of levies, he knew the old style of legions wouldn't work. So Camillus rebuilt the legion from the ground up, learning from his enemy and turning it against them. Each man was given a position depending on how much armor he could afford and his fighting experience. The traditional hoplite would remain, but so few of the heavily armored warriors had survived the battle that they had to be kept in reserve as a last line of defense. In front of them, he would put 2 lines of light soldiers equipped with short stabbing spears. They would wear bronze helmets and carry large rectangular shields, nearly identical to the Gauls. Ahead of his army would be levies armed with javelins to harass the enemy and screen their advance at the start of the battle. And finally, on each wing would be flanking cavalry. So as Brennus tossed his sword onto the scales, he was greeted by the sound of a trumpet. Camillus had arrived. Brennus's men seized the gold and withdrew from the city. They knew there was no way to maneuver in the burned-out streets. He had outpaced the Romans in the past, and he could do it again now. But 8 miles outside the city, along the Via Gabbiana on the Trausian Plain, Camillus caught up with him. Seeing the new and untested army arrayed before him, Brennus contemptuously turned his men, then charged. The only records of the Battle of the Trausian Plain say that it was a close-run thing. As the Gauls came at them, the levies hurled their javelins and then retreated back behind the front line, the Hastati. The Gauls threw their own spears and then crashed into them, a wall of barbarian fury. The lightest armed and the least experienced, the Hastati wavered. Now, the second part of Camillus' new army was put to the test. The checkerboard formation. His second line, the more experienced Principes, were sent in. And the cavalry sent to the flanks. Seeing their approach, Brennus threw everything he had at Camillus. For them, there would be no retreat, only death or victory. All the Gallic chieftains charged in. But even the combined Hastati and Principes couldn't hold them. The entire line was pushed back. And in the words of the Romans, rem ad triarios redisse. It came down to the triarii. The disgraced survivors of the Battle of the Allia, the men who had shamed themselves in the eyes of Jupiter, locked shields once more and braced for impact. We don't actually know what happened on the Battle of the Trausian Plains. The historical sources are frustratingly vague. All we know is that Rome, of course, wins. Brennus disappears from history, and the Gallic army is wiped out, though they will be immortalized as one of Rome's greatest enemies. And Camillus' manipular reforms become the new standard for the legions. He then goes on to rebuild Rome, brick by brick, investing his own fortune back into the city. They hail him as its second founder, and he goes on to defend Rome for another 20 years, fighting and defeating all comers. But it's his final act that was his most lasting, when as an old man he stood before the Senate and asked that they start the plebeians down the road to equality, and to give them access to the highest positions of government. The following year, a plague swept through Rome and killed both patrician and plebeian without mercy, reminding them that they're all equal in the eyes of the gods. But even then, one man was mourned above all other. Statesman, dictator, general, and the second founder of Rome. Camillus was carried into history, unconquered, as Rome rose from its ashes. Thanks for watching.